Okay, class. Our next session for this week is on Agile estimating and tracking. Estimating and tracking is a notoriously difficult thing to do in any kind of software engineering lifecycle, not just Agile. So Agile has its own particular thoughts and ways of doing it. Um, so we're going to talk about those things, and hopefully those things will be directly useful in the context of your projects. So what I'd like to do, I want to start by asking you a few questions. So I'd um, like you to think about these kinds of things and maybe pause the video for a second. But think about something like, what is your gut? What do you feel when you're working on a programming assignment for class? You know, usually we're not too disciplined about estimating the amount of time it takes to do something and tracking our time. In fact, that's part of the reason you did the personal software process, and of course, that's a topic for your project. Um, but a lot of times, we kind of get a gut feel, right? So your instructor posts an assignment, you go read through it, do a little Q&A, you get an idea of its scope. Then you're thinking, well, geez, this is going to take me a long time. I better get a head start in this, or I think it's kind of easy. My classmates too, when I talk to them or exchange emails or whatnot, I think that's one that's not going to be too bad. And maybe I could start just the night before it's due. Only the most disciplined might actually sit down and be like, I think that's going to take me 8 hours, and I will set aside 4 hours on this night, 2 hours on that night, and so forth. The PSP teaches you to try and be a little bit more like that. And most of us, throughout, your programming assignments that you've had and perhaps your real life work, probably you don't track your work that much. And that was another emphasis of teaching you the PSP was, you probably would be surprised if you track how long it takes you to do assignments versus how long you would think it would take you to do an assignment. We're just notoriously bad estimators at how long it takes for us to do something, particularly something related to software development. But then again, you'll start that homework, you start doing that program. Um, and maybe, my web development class, I give assignments that are roughly 10 to 15 days due later. And, I could tell after a week there's some students that finally start really looking at it. And you could tell they're kind of thinking in the back of their mind, well, geez, I'm kind of really way behind here. This is going to be difficult to get done on time. Or, they get a head start or something clicks all of a sudden and they go, wow, yay, I'm way ahead. I can take it easy and not quite get into there. So we kind of go into these gut instincts, but, and the more we know ourselves, the more we're good at that kind of relative estimating. So I want you to think as I talk about agile estimating and tracking, what goes into those thoughts and feelings? How do you arrive at them? Have they evolved over time as you get more and more experience? Okay. Okay. To set the context, I wanted to put this up as a reminder. You should remember this from our user story and Scrum board conversations a couple weeks ago. That relationship of how we go about our sprint. Remember, we talked about we start with our customer defining value. What was that? Right? Defining value was story points. Okay, this is the estimate of business value. So this right here, this is an estimate. All right. Story points are that relative value because to take an individual feature and actually put a dollar sign on it and have your customer be able to do that in the context of this planning exercise that Agile goes through, is not really realistic. Very few organizations could actually do that, but they do get a feel for what's more valuable and what's less valuable, and not an exact necessarily notion of relative worth, but kind of a pretty good way to bucketize it into different things. Gave those to the programmers, the development team, and then the development teams estimate cost, right? How much work it's going to be. And I even talked about there something called t-shirt sizing. Again, another estimate of something. And again, the point of a relative estimate there and putting in these buckets was that as developers, we're just not very good at estimating down to the hour how much work something is going to be. And again, we talked about up front, remember our conversation about task activity networks, where we tried to create this Gantt chart and this network of, here's a set of tasks and here's how this one will take 3 days, this one will take 8 days, this one will take 11 days, put it out on our Gantt chart and our Microsoft project or something like that, try and create some wiggle room and see if we can manage the critical path. And we talked about how that's not really a very sustainable thing. It's not very change friendly, and we're trying to embrace change. So this is kind of the Agile notion of relative estimates as a way to you know, as long as we're in the ballpark, we can we'll steer Super Mario our way around it. Okay. And then we talked about that notion of choosing value. So that is what that really is the customer says, let me look at these, let me look at these, my size or my value and cost estimates, and do that kind of trade-off, that return on investment kind of thing. And then we have to build value. Well, as the programmers, we're also going to talk today about this one, because we build value. How do we know how we're progressing on things? How do we know we're making progress in the rate that we need to, in order to achieve the business value defined for the sprint? So today we're going to kind of revisit this one, first quadrant, the 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock, if you will, and the 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Okay, so we're going to start with estimating. All right, agile methods for estimation. All right, planning, and there's three. There's actually a short reading out on Blackboard I'm putting out this week. It'll also talk about t-shirt sizing. It'll also talk about something called relative mass valuation, which is really just card sorting. I'll talk about those at the end. So let me talk in a little bit more depth about something called planning poker. Planning poker is an agile version of something called wideband Delphi. And when you take 416 and you revisit estimation, you're going to talk about a notion, something called wideband Delphi that Barry Beam wrote a paper on. The point of this, and there's a key word I want to write right on here, is it kind of says, we know we're not very good at estimating, but if we can get a collection of individuals to kind of think and converge on a common estimate, then at least everyone in the team will feel comfortable with it. I mean, will it make them more right? Well, it kind of like code review. It's, the more eyes on it, the better. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be right. It's not necessarily empirically driven. It's experience driven. But at least everybody in a team kind of comes to a common agreement is the goal. And as they go in that common agreement, they'll start to reveal the assumptions they're making when making such an estimate. I apologize. It's weather's bad out here. I got a cold, so I'm going to have a scratchy throat for this one. Okay, so every developer participates, maybe some of the other team members, but really, if you're estimating the work, your tasks, if you will, or you're doing that, if we're doing this part, this is the script talks about, the estimating cost of stories, really should be the development team, but the product owner conducts a session. So that is your team. Here's a script. And actually, before I start the script, I want to show you. You can actually go out to the Practical Agile site. I actually run a workshop in Agile occasionally, and they actually have cards. You would take cards and you can print them out, or you can actually get mailed customized playing cards. So it's literally called poker. So you can do some of the estimates. I don't know what the estimate should be. The estimate's worth 0. There's no cost to that whatsoever. Then you go up into Fibonacci, 1, 2, 3, and these numbers have different values on them. And then maybe if something is too small, like you think, this thing is too small to estimate, you estimate it as too, you take the small card and put it in your hand, or maybe you think it's too large. You put the too big one in there. All right, that's our kind of trawling from requirements kind of thing we talked about with the Kool-Aid. But the point is everybody gets some of these cards, right? They get their own deck of these cards. The product owner starts with a user story and reads it aloud, and then each estimator selects an estimate card and puts it face down. All right? This is poker. You pick one card out of your hand and you put it face down, and then you all roll them up together. All right? So you're all showing your cards together, right? That's the poker part. And so now you discover what everybody's estimate was, and that way nobody's biased, right? Somebody could have put down for a story an estimate really low, like 1, or somebody could have put down an estimate of 25, of 40, right? You take those at the end. So what statistics will tell us is if you take a set of data points where you're estimating within a range, if there's enough definition to the story, you're going to form that kind of normal curve. Your normal curve is your bell curve, right? Your Gaussian. That looks something like this. What that means is, let's say, you guys are working in teams of 4. Let's say, for argument's sake, you're working in a little larger team, 6 or 7. What statistics would tell you is that, well, you're probably in this meaty part of the curve, 4 or 5 of the 7 are all going to be in that range, but you're going to have a few outliers, somebody out here, who made a completely different estimate, right? So maybe a lot of the team estimated it as an 8, but there's somebody over here, Susie, did it as 1, and Jimmy did it as 25, let's say. You take the highs and lows, Jimmy and Susie, and then they have a short discussion of the varying estimates. They have the discussion in front of everybody. The reason why that's important is that gets assumptions out in the open, right? So Susie might have said, "Well, I estimated really low because I thought, we had this software already in our code repository. I know of this open source package. We'll slam that in there, configure it. We're done, right?" And Jimmy might say, "Geez, I've never, even heard of how to do that before. It's kind of fear the unknown. So, I think that's going to be really big." And everybody else is kind of in between. So having the assumptions by which folks make their estimates, and having the right amount of discussion, usually starts to lead to this bell curve starting to narrow until eventually you get to, pretty much consensus. Everybody's in the same ballpark. Everybody's, let's say they get to the 5 to 8 point range. Close enough. Pick one at that point, average them if you want. But you're pretty much all in the same ballpark. There's no real outliers anymore. That's pretty much what this says as you estimate around and you go in rounds. In practice, I think even for the hardest requirements, you're done within 3 rounds. A lot of times it's 2 rounds, but very often it's 3 rounds. There are some rules, but planning poker can be fairly informal. Meaning, like step 5, high and low estimators have a short discussion of the varying estimates. How much discussion has to happen, and it starts with the high and low estimators, but really, then other folks can start to chime in, right? It's structured around their assumptions, but then other folks, "Oh yeah, I made that assumption too, Susie, but I thought this," or, "Jimmy, I thought it was unknown too, but I did a quick check and so forth. It's really not that big a deal." And that kind of open conversation gets everybody's, pardon the pun, cards on the table. So you understand where that estimate's coming from. So again, normally it drives fairly rapidly, particularly because you're normally talking about relatively small teams. I mean, this method, wideband Delphi, and this convergence, these convergence methods, these have been used for workshops with dozens of people, type of estimating, not just in small teams. So when you're in small teams, very often, on the second round, at least on the third round, you've normally converged into a range of estimates for your story points that everybody's comfortable with. As I said, there's other flavors of estimation methods. T-shirt sizing, the small, medium, large, extra large, double extra large kind of sizing. That's the discrete bucket approach. The relative mass valuation. In relative mass valuation, basically what you do is you take those index cards representing the user stories, you lay them all out on a big table. I did this a few years back in 316, but you lay them all out on the table and you just start putting cards that were large estimates in one corner, small estimates in the other, putting other ones, and you kind of just divide and conquer, and it became a card sorting exercise, right, to get all the cards prioritized. First you prioritize them into high, medium, large, then within the high ones you reprioritize just that bucket and so forth until eventually you got down to the leaf nodes and you had a set of estimates for every single card fully sorted. This is kind of good, and it could still be good in your projects. Maybe I should have talked about this in the first sprint. That kind of technique, that kind of card sorting is very useful on when you're starting up a project, when you're filling up that initial product backlog. And in real product, you may have hundreds of things on the product backlog, and you're trying to go through them, fairly quickly. Planning poker is pretty quick. T-shirt sizing, pretty quick because you converge quickly. But if you're doing it every single card, well, that can take a bit much. In these different card sorting techniques, normally you can do a mass of cards a bit quicker. All right. What I suggest for you and your teams, whether you do a formal planning poker, whether you just want a relative estimate and T-shirt sizing, or relative mass valuation, a card sorting, however you want to do it. What the key thing that I would like every single team to do is converge. It should be a team-oriented discussion. So I know we're doing, the approximation because we don't have a true product owner, but when you go through and estimate anything, both the value of a story or the task, I know, the natural thing is, hey, each member of the team, you go write 4 stories, you go write 4 stories, you go write 4 stories, so we can get the number of stories in the product backlog that Dr. Gary wants. Go through and write up the first set of tasks and throw some estimates for hours on them or something. But that's not estimating. Is what I'm saying is, in an agile way, it's best done as convergence, which means you need everybody engaged. When you're doing the planning session, the expectation is that you will go through this process and that you will do a discussion to define value and to estimate cost. I know it's going to be rapid. I know it's going to be over the internet. Hopefully you can get together synchronously and do it, because certainly that'll go faster, and the nature of the discussion will be better. But really, it's not a divide and conquer. You go write 5 stories in their tasks and estimate it all out and do all this all by yourself. This whole side, this is a group activity, right? Agile as a whole is a group activity, but certainly this right side is a group activity the most. This left side, okay, sometimes when you get down to your task, you're building value by yourself and you're just giving constant feedback to the team. Maybe the product owner, the customer, goes off in a corner and says, okay, here's what I want. So it is all team oriented, but particularly on this side when you do these estimates. I would really like you to practice convergence techniques for these things. Whether or not you decide to do a formal planning poker, or you do a t-shirt sizing or a relative mass valuation. I mean, you all play kind of games where, it's like, 1, 2, 3, what's your estimate kind of thing. You do that with board games sometimes, right? So whichever estimation method you want to use, the point is, 1, make it in a group, and 2, try and go in these rounds like the script said and see where you get convergence, all right, and get the team talking about their common understanding. And you'll find that it's really worthwhile, because then you'll all get to not just a common estimate, you'll get to a common convergence of understanding. We talked about user stories being a placeholder for a conversation where you come to that common understanding with the customer. Well, what about common understanding between the developers, right? These kinds of convergence techniques with relative estimates gives you enough granularity of an estimate combined with gaining that common understanding, getting those common assumptions out in the open. Okay, that's a short bit on estimation. Let's talk a little bit about tracking. So now we're going 9 to 12 o'clock, right? Now we are, boy, I made a mess of this one, right? But we're over here, all right? We're 9 to 12 o'clock, and now we want to talk about tracking our work and tracking how well we're building value during our sprint. So we've planned out the sprint. Sprint started. Everybody's taking tasks and they're starting to do their work. One informal measure, by the way, and I don't have a picture of a Scrum board handy in these notes, but one informal metric is, over time, when you look at your Scrum board, right? Your Scrum board has all those user stories down the left, and then you start with some initial set of tasks in the column right next to it, and you don't have much in progress, test, and done, right? That's not how it starts. But as you go over time, you start to see, okay, we got our user stories, but now we got some tasks here, but now we're seeing some tasks here, to eventually, toward the end of the sprint, we'll see stories, and then all the stuff should be on the right if we're closing it all out. Right? That's an informal visual metric that you can use in that physical information radiator when you're in a physical space. Well, what if you're not? Is there other techniques that you can use? And there are. You're going to talk about something called earned values when you take 416. Earned value analysis. Earned values are Agile technique for describing how much value a team is building on something. So again, when we look at our tasks and our task activity network, oops, hit the wrong thing. And again, I should, you know what? I'm going to real quick throw in a blank slide, because I'm sitting here trying to draw over these things and making a mess of them. So let me get a blank slide up here and go back. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is we estimate in that microsite. So we have a set of tasks, task 1, task 2, task 3. We do task 1 for some period of time. When it's done, we do task 2. At a time we do task 3. A Gantt chart. Maybe we have a task 4 here that is more independent and goes kind of in between them and has a set of softer concurrent requirements and so forth. All kinds of ways you can do these task activity networks. The point being, though, is we lay this out over time. So maybe this is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7, and there's a week for us, right? And the issue is your project manager's trying to track day by day how, whether or not, hey, on day 2 we should be right here, and on day 3 we should have finished 1 and started part of 4, and so forth, and tries to measure exactly where you are in these tasks. And again, if you're not and task 4 hasn't started, you got to slide it to the right, and does that work out with this dependency link, and all those kinds of challenges that we talked about. This is tracking work, right? Tests are work to be done. But as we've already talked about in Agile, it's not really about the tests. The tests are things that a traditional project manager working in a task activity network will try and control these tasks and who's working on them and resource them, because once the tasks are set, it's all about tracking those tasks. But in Agile, we said, well, maybe we found out we don't need task 2 at all. Right? We could take it off the board and we can put in something else, or we can modify it or whatnot, that the tasks are owned by the dev team, not by some PM somewhere. All right? Okay, well, if that's the case, how do you start tracking stuff when the sprint's going on? You got 2 weeks, you got 3 weeks, you got 30 days, whatever the length of the sprint. How do you track stuff? Well, the point is what you really want to track, if you're an Agilist, is how much you want to track value, and that's what earned values would do. In an earned value chart, every time that you build value for the customer, right, meaning you've added some dollars by implementing some feature, you would go along in time, and when it's done, you ring the cash register, and you just made X number of dollars. And you go along for something, and another one's done, and so you get a new set of value, and you go along and you get a new set of value. Well, in Agile terms, these dollar signs again, those are our story points, right? So what we earn when we complete a user story, and done means done, meaning all the way through test, is we earn story points, okay? And so this is kind of the foundation of earned value, and notice the shape of the curve, and it's a bit different than trying to track, what percentage of work is done over here. And again, when we're, on this chart, this is time going along the x-axis, and this is, the y-axis is story points, right? But nowhere on here is there, and tasks are not on here, okay? They're not a measure of value, they're a measure of work. So a burn down chart in Agile terms is really taking an earned value chart and flipping it so you start at the top and you burn down over time. So they just flip the axis, the y-axis really. Started from, our goal was to build 100 points worth of work, and at the end we want to be down to 0 because we want to finish all those things in the time it takes to do whatever sprint, can't spell, we're on. Okay, that's the gist of what we're going to talk about, and there are some variations. I find even for something as basic as burn down charts, folks kind of have a little different view of what they're measuring in their burn down, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so I've already talked about a bunch on this slide. You're going to have a link to Coburn's paper, really blog post on how burn downs are like earned values. But effectively, here's what I was just trying to draw on the other thing. We have story points on this axis, and apparently in this sprint, the team was trying to build 70 story points. 70 because that's a story point on the bottom of user story, 1, user story 2, user story 3, and user story 4. Maybe they're building 4 user stories. Sum them up and you get to 70. Boom, sprint starts. You go along and you start building value. And so maybe this is the completion of a user story, maybe user story 2, okay? And maybe that was worth roughly about, 15 points, okay? That guy was 15, so I completed that so I can count its value. Now, at the time, maybe there's also some adjustment, all right, in the estimate. Now, I don't really believe in re-estimating stories in the story parts in mid-sprint. Some folks allow you to do that. So maybe, yeah, we completed 2, but at the same time we realized by doing 2 that 3 is actually going to cost, plus 5 more points than it did. And that's how, so maybe that one's considered here, right? And we had to add a few points because now we found 1 was different. And maybe we completed that. This is user story 1. And then we had a decrease in scope. Somebody came along and said, don't do something. Don't do user story 4. And then this last one maybe is a user story 5. You look at your burn down chart. I'm making this up because you need obviously to be looking at your burn down chart side by side with your Scrum board. And in fact, in real organizations, the burn down chart is literally physically on the board right next to where all the story and task stickies are. In your virtual tools tag and otherwise, there's a view that can show you your story points, and I'm going to take you to that at the end of this talk. The point here, there's a few variations that I will come back to. Actually, let me talk about them now. So we're talking about when a user story is completed, you can subtract it from what you're doing. And I'm going to erase so you can see this again, because if you're seeing this slide well and paying attention to it, and you might want to look at the bigger form in the PDFs, you might notice a little elbow. Darn it. I lost my pen again. That happens sometimes. Let me get it back. Okay, I think I'm back. So I see an elbow. I see a little elbow. I see a little elbow. An elbow meaning a little part where there's an inflection point. There's a little bit more pronounced. These are slight elbows. There's different techniques for counting when you're doing a burn down chart. Okay. One technique for counting is to count story points done. Meaning you count all of the points of a story when it's completely done. You can move the story card over to the right on the chart, or your tool marks it as done, because all the tasks are done and the user story and its acceptance test are completed. 100%. There's literally no more task. It's closed. It's done. 100% done. And in which case, when you do that, it's a delta from, you count it all at once. You go from here to here in instant in time. A second way is story points percentage in test, and then the rest of percent in done. And that's kind of what's going on here. What do I mean by that? Let's look at one that's pronounced. Let me look at this one right here. Okay. As I said, there's an elbow here. What I'm saying is from here to here represents a move of a story to test. All right. The start of working on it was here. The end of moving all the tasks to test is here. And then this part, you get the last percentage of it, when you tested it and you move it to done. All right. From this perspective, this one is giving some amount of credit for getting something at least close to test. I don't really like that. That's kind of a historical artifact. I don't even know that many organizations that do it that way anymore. But it's kind of an implication because, when you get something, done except for the validation part, folks like to feel it's done. Very often somebody else is doing the validation. Maybe you got QA involved or another developer. And so, the developers involved in that user story may move on. They may be specialized resources. So you give them, the majority of the credit once you go to test, and then the rest when you're done. I don't really like that approach, frankly. I mean, to me, I well prefer one, and it's more common. Count all the story points when you're done. When done means done. Let me erase again here and talk about the third one. Third one is to count tasks completed. And once we count tasks completed, we went back to counting work being done. So now this instead of this y-axis would be some measure of tasks. Those tasks could be measured as t-shirts. Some folks still do hours. All right. Some places just simply a count of how many tasks are done. But now the y-axis has changed from story points to tasks, and now we're kind of estimating back in this how much work have we done kind of model. All right. The rate at which you work, by the way, is referred to as velocity, and what velocity really is kind of, spell it better, is really supposed to be a measure of the rate over time of building value. So change in value over time. But the rate at which you work should be building a relatively predictive amount of value. And over time, you should understand well the team's capacity for work over time, their ability to build value over time. Again, a lot of folks do this, and you have to recognize when you look at a burn down, or if you work in an agile organization, which way they're burning down. But I'm not a big fan of burning down based on tasks, because to me it sounds like the old school way of just counting the amount of work you've done. Again, you could work all the live long day and never build value for the customer. And Agile says to focus on building that value. That it doesn't actually really matter how much work that you build. Now, in the context of a class, of course, I give you a class project and I tell you work 5 hours a week or work 10 hours a week, whether you're, which section of my class you're in. But, how much value can you build in that 10 hours? And is it constant? Is it fixed? Versus, I could tell you, well, you have to build this much value. I've actually told you the other, because we're in a time box class. Work 10 hours a week in the online class. That gives you the amount of capacity you work per sprint, but it's not a commitment on how much value. So teams have asked me, what do we do at the end if we still have user stories on our Scrum board and that we didn't get to? Oh, kick them back to the product backlog and re-estimate them. But in reality, if you were really bad at that and you're always kicking stories back, then you would have an examination of, well, what's our velocity and why is it that we don't understand it very well? Okay, but that's an aside. Effectively, for our purposes, we are going to consider 1 and 3. Estimating work and tracking work and tracking building value. And of course that goes, I'm going to go right back to it. Back to the messy slide, right? We were defining value and we were estimating cost. So what do we want to track? Well, you can either track or you can track both. You could track how much value you're building at a time when you're building value, and it does say build value over here, or you can track work. What your cost is and how much work you're getting through. All right. Again, you could track both. Okay. So if you have those alternatives of tracking value versus tracking work, then when you look at the shape of a burn down chart, one is you should be able to tell what it's measuring. Is it measuring work completed or is it measuring value built? And second is you should get a feel for risk when you look at the shape of the curve. In other words, not only that, but you should know where the project's going well and which one's the riskiest. So let's look at some of these charts and try and understand what they're telling us. Okay. So, and I just grabbed examples off of Google. So here's one off of Wikipedia. First is time. So how do you read and parse one of these things? First, understand your legend. There's a count bar chart on the bottom of completed tasks. So it's already using the language of tasks. It's talking about remaining effort. It's not talking about remaining value, right? So this blue line here, all right, that one is remaining effort. There's always an ideal line for the ideal burn down, which is normally drawn, pretty much is always drawn linearly, starting at the top from the beginning of the sprint to the end. It's just a straight tracking line, right down. And then remaining tasks. There's our language of tasks again, and this gives a count of how much work was supposed to be done on something. So when you look at this chart, let me erase, I'm writing over the lines. A few things if you understand that legend that you want to parse, right? We got time along here. And I lost my pen again. We've got time on this side. And this says it right here, remaining effort in hours. So the first thing is this is tracking work, not value. Okay. Okay, what else? Second thing. Notice how the remaining tasks will be their estimate, and the remaining effort, well, this has a double y-axis. This is the count. So that's measured on that side of the axis, and this is the remaining effort. You'll notice almost from the start of the sprint through at least to this point, right? Roughly day 10 to 11, and this is a 23-week sprint. So just about halfway through the sprint, the remaining effort and the remaining tasks were above the ideal line. All right, which means, especially when you're tracking work, there's no reason to be deviating. This is a relatively fixed rate, right? So in terms of the amount of work, these folks got immediately behind, right starting here, day 3, 4, 5, and particularly day around 6 and 7, right? We had so somebody misestimated something, or there's some new task that was added to the board. The estimate actually went up, so it looked like the team lost ground, and we have more effort remaining until we get to about day 10. Okay? Then at day 10, somebody finished, the team, I should say, finished a whole set of tasks, and it, kind of had a good couple days going right through here from day 11 through 13 or 14, and that caused a whole bunch of effort to go off to the point where now our count of tasks may be higher, but we finished a few, you could tell, a few big tasks and actually got underneath the line. And then we tracked the line a little bit better to the end of the sprint. All right. And so this is not a bad burn down chart from the perspective of, yes, all the work met here. And certainly by the end, notice the narrowness of both blue lines with respect to the green line toward the end. It gets better than where we were up here and the delta and distance up here. Okay. So from this perspective, I would have felt like there was risk and threat to in the beginning of the sprint, and perhaps the Scrum Master removed some obstacles or some impediments, or the team spiked on something, but something changed around the midpoint where risk went down here, and this actually is a reasonably decently behaved project in the second half of the sprint. All right. So from our criteria, did the project go well? It went well because we finished all the tasks. The chart's measuring work. The chart represents some amount of risk in the first half, but less risk in the second half. Second one, this is another one I grabbed off. Again, let's parse it the same way. In this case, we have an ideal line. This one's measuring weeks. This is a longer project. It talks about weeks elapsed, but over here it measures undone features. So this is an aggregate feature account. In fact, this may be a bit more of a burn down chart for an entire release, given the length of time over half a year here. But no matter what the distance of time, I mean, let's talk about the shape of the curve. If I'm measuring features here, then this is a count of features, and I'm tracking. I still have an idealized line. I'm probably trying to get all those features out by week 25 because I'm probably doing some measure of stabilization here or transitioning into the customer's hands. My count starts to deviate from the ideal, but then boom, all of a sudden I start getting a bunch done. I mean, look at this period. In this weeks 9 or 10, all of a sudden I knocked out 10 features and got well below the line before things started to creep up. Then over here, well, here's an increase in scope. All right, I actually had the number of features, so I thought I had one done, and now I don't, or somebody added something. And then I went down here, but the same thing, stuff went up again. There's an increase of scope. This shows what an increase of scope looks like before I finally start getting things down. If you notice, even though I had a target, let's see, that's probably week 25, even though I had a target of being done for stabilization over the last 8 weeks, instead I still had 18 features roughly to implement, and I was implementing all the way to the end, which means I probably jeopardized some measure of my quality along the way, right? So this project, what's it measuring? So one, it's measuring features. When we measure features, we're measuring value, not work. Our second question, right? Well, that was our second question. Did the project go well? And was it risky? Well, I mean, it went well in the sense everything was done, but it didn't go well in terms of being this far off and having to finish a whole bunch of features very rapidly over the last 8 weeks when we're supposed to be testing. So I'd say no, this project didn't go very well. And risk, was there significant risk? Well, there was certainly significant risk once we got from here on out, right? This is the opposite. This one actually started off reasonably well. We got below the line. We never deviated too much. But here we have big amounts of deviation in here from what the ideal is, what we were tracking. That suggests significant risk. And this one's riskier than the first one, I would say, because that risk happened. This is less risk over here, greater risk over here. And, having great risk toward the end of a project, well, that's risky. That's not something you really want to do. Okay. Third one. This one's not quite complete. We're tracking through, and this is a 2-week sprint. This is a day-by-day measure. Again, we have time along the right. We have work over here. So we are tracking work. We are tracking tasking, things that the team does. Okay. When you look at it, you see that the tasks start off flat, and then boom, there's a big drop in one day. All kinds of reasons that kind of thing happened. One is, maybe some folks took a couple days off. Maybe the team wasn't really working in the beginning. Maybe they forgot to update their Scrum board. Because or maybe as they were finding out more about, the stories, they started to realize that, more tasks had to be added. And maybe they found out here on March 15th that, yeah, they did a bunch of work, but maybe they also found out that, that they drastically overestimated some things. Maybe some things went by really quick. Because remember, this says work remaining. All right, this is not work completed. All right, so yeah, we're tracking it from a work or tasking perspective, but what we're doing is summing up the hours remaining if we did hours based, not T-shirt based. So let me back up. A lot of companies still estimate in hours. They need some currency, and frankly, they need to understand their costs. They need to understand their burn rate. So they'll still say, we think that's going to take 8 hours. We think that's going to take 4 hours and whatnot. The relative sizing is just not something that they're comfortable with. So it's not all that unusual to still see a burn down chart measured in hours. That being said, the hours can be budgeted out from a resource perspective and burned down at a fixed rate. But in terms of understanding whether the team's on track for their burn rate, you have to understand how much work is remaining, not how much is done. So even though I'm saying quite clearly that I'd prefer not tracking how much work. I'd rather track story point value over tasks done. The point is, if you are going to track work or tasks, at least from an estimate of whether you're going to get there or not, you're better off tracking remaining versus tracking how much you've done so far. Now, again, like the first one, and I know it's a mess, but if you could actually do remaining effort as well as a count of them and get an idea of how many of you completed in here as well, you could track all those things at once. But if you had to pick one thing to track, I'd track remaining. Because remaining is going to tell us whether or not we're getting back toward the idealized line. All right. Now, this is another project like the first one. Some things that are good about this. Notice how for the majority of this project, we are underneath the line. It was only at the very beginning. So this is an example of a sprint that kicked off, and after 3 days into the sprint, the team, was really getting its footing at first, understanding what's going on. And again, maybe some people took some days off. And then they started to say, okay, we've got a handle on the sprint. So I would have expected if I looked at the Scrum board that there was a lot of change tasks. They were re-estimated, they were taken off the board, or maybe some ones that had big estimates originally were actually surprisingly done quickly because once somebody got in and actually did it, they realized maybe that wasn't as big a deal as we originally worried about when we're doing the sprint planning. So another form of change, if you will, is you could also be wildly wrong about your estimates in kind of to your favor, if you will. Once the team got from here to burning off the next 103 remaining hours, they worked below, they kept dropping below the line. They dropped even more below the line, before coming in close to the line. But, as they come into the last few days of the sprint, they've been tracking work about work remaining. And when you get down to the smaller numbers in this part, it's easier to stay on track, when you're only this much left versus to stay on track when you're in the beginning and there's a whole granularity. I mean, our ability to forecast anything, finances, weather, and certainly work remaining gets better the smaller window we're talking about. Even predictive planning, 3 days I got left to estimate. I'll probably do a lot better at 3 days than I will at 14 days. Okay. So this example, this is actually a project that tracks work. That was our question too. Is the project successful? I'd say so. I think they're a good chance of being successful given what they're tracking. And is the project risky? No, not really. This is an acceptable level of risk. Now again, how do you measure risk? You measure risk not, risk takes more forms. I mean, certainly if you're up here and you have and you're far off the line, you have a great risk of being able to hit your target date, right? And you're talking about a short time period, so it's hard to find resources to fill in the gap and plug them in. So if you're above the line, you are jeopardizing, your success, your ability to achieve a sprint goal and keep the customer, product owner happy. However, if you're way down here, I'd say even this, if you're way off on this, that means that, your poor estimating of your task is actually leading to an inefficient team, a team that's not utilizing their capacity to their fullest, and that's not something you want to do either. I mean, frankly, maybe this team kind of got back toward the line because they started to coast, right? They decided, it's time to get out of work early and go watch a movie or something, or I'm going to spend more time, on Facebook for the afternoon because we're ahead, right? It doesn't matter as long as we meet this date. We're pretty far ahead, so and they kind of squandered some of their capacity for not doing much. I mean, we don't actually know that from this chart, but the point being is, if you have an ideal line and you're way below it, that's better than being way above it, but that's still inefficient estimating, and your tracking will tell you that. Okay, and then the last one. This one shaped a lot differently, right? Time on the left. This goes May to May 21st, another 2-week sprint. We have 0 to 80 here, and you can't really see it, but that says story points, and the red line is remaining values. So, answer to our second question, this is measuring value. Okay, and not only is it measuring value, but this to me is a really good explicit chart of what it's like to measure value. This is personally what I like to see. When I'm trying to evaluate whether a team is building value. Why is that? If you notice, there's a clear shape to this curve here, and this thing is these discrete drops. Okay, this is called a step function. Okay, so by having a step function, it says we are going to count all of a user story's points when done. What I was saying before is our first one. So this one, measuring value, doing it when story points are entirely done. Are other questions? Did the project go well? Does it represent risk? Well, I don't know if this one went well. If you notice, eventually they got down to this line here, and this is the ideal line. But seeing where they were on May, from May 17th to 18th, and the sprint closes here, they were still way up here out of a sprint that started at, I don't know, what's that, maybe 73 story points. They were here, which is roughly just, well, I didn't draw that straight, but somewhere around 50. Right? In other words, they only got about a third of the story points through the first, 10 days, 11 days of the sprint. All right. So they're not tracking anywhere near the idealized line. Again, I look at risk as the area under this curve, above or below the line, but certainly above the line. The more area I have in here, the riskier the things are. I'm threatening project success. Now, somehow they were able to recover. We're not exactly sure how they were able to recover. You see some of these particular circles on here. There's even one where it dropped and went back up. Again, there are ways to track some intermediate states on things. Maybe these are tasks overlaid as things go from in progress to test to done. Maybe something was revalued or rescoped here or whatnot. There are little nuances like that. But from our perspective, this project, assuming that they actually built all this, it was successful because it got down here before the end. So technically, was it successful? Yes. but I would say this was pretty risky because of how much space we had underneath here as we went into the second week of the sprint. Okay? Again, lesson for you, the closer you track to the idea line, the better you are. If you're in a, you know what, I'm going to do it this way. Let me again see if I can, I'm going to go back and, before we go to that, I'm going to go create another, that's not what I wanted to do. You can tell both by my posts in the class and by me working on this Windows computer that I'm not lying. I'm really not a Windows guy. I haven't been for years. Okay, anyway, that aside, why did I bring up a blank slide? Looking at the patterns of our curves, if you are looking at building value, then when you look at a story burn down chart where this is story points on this side and this is time, right? And you're tracking the idealized line. One is certainly it's not, you're going to have that step function like we just looked at. And certainly you're going to start off above because, you're probably not going to finish many stories in a day's time. But as you get closer and you start counting these discrete steps, on the all or nothing, if you're closing as you go, even if you're remaining above the line, and again, yeah, normally in the second half of a sprint, you'll start completing more stories. But if you go in this relative pattern tracking close to the idealized line and look how many stories we closed as we went, okay, then you're probably doing that pull model I was talking about. The pull model says is I'm going to go to the scrum board and I'm going to move, when I look, let me do it down the bottom big. When I go down to the scrum board and I look at this is my user story column and I have my story cards here. And I have my tasks that I start initially. As I move tasks across over time, I'm going to move a row at a time. So this is done over here, test in progress, which means I'm only going to start with the first couple and move those across. And I'm going to get them in the done column so I can count them earlier in the sprint. All right. If I do it the other way and I start pushing everything into in progress and I put some stuff into test but I don't finish it, what's going to happen? Well, things can't get counted. Let me see if I can switch colors. The pattern of that one is going to be different, right? Let me pick a blue here. So the pattern of a one where I'm pushing across the board is I'm going to go across and I can't count anything because, I put them into test and I'm working on them all at once. Right? So I'm doing a whole bunch of work, but I can't count any value. And all of a sudden, I'll try and close a whole bunch of stories at the end. And all of a sudden, I'll have big drops like that, and I'll try and get there. All right? But when I'm doing that, the push model, right, that blue is push. All right? When I'm doing that push model, boom, look at the area under the curve compared to the idealized line. It's huge. Right? I have bigger risk associated. Bigger risk that I'll actually get these things all the way done. All right? And what will happen instead is I'll get to the end of the sprint and I'll have a bunch of stuff half done, stuck in progress, into test, and it gets kind of messy to kick that back to the backlog. So it's considered a better practice to try and use a pull model where you can finish a row at a time, pulling, start from the user story and pull it across the board, and so even the visual pattern that you see a day-by-day basis should reflect that pull. I encourage teams to actually go out and take a snapshot of a screen snapshot every day. One year I actually made teams do that. Every day, go out and grab a snapshot of your scrum board and see what pattern it's following. Because it's more if you divide and conquer. So if I start with these and I say, okay, team member 1, team member 2, team member 3, and you do divide and conquer, what invariably happens is you get a whole bunch of stuff that folks are working on. It gets stuck in progress, and only some of them make it across the board. Some of them don't. Then team members 1 and 2 get annoyed because they got their stuff done, but the rest doesn't get done. Totally not agile. It's not collective code ownership. It's not we're all in this together. Instead, you should see more team members involved one at a time, and to do this red line, all right, to be doing this stair-step model closer to the idealized line and counting stories all the way across the sprint. Okay, that's how you interpret these things. That's how you look at it. That's what I'll be looking at when I do things. I mean, I'll see some Tega boards I know that go along like the blue line, and I'll look at their, I go out and I am looking at scrum boards periodically, and I'm actually the TA went out and even gave you comments, and when I see this pattern and everybody's tasks are stuck in progress, I mean, I know you're working. If we look at our task chart, yeah, the task chart would still show a nice even line because you're working, right? You could even be working more than the idealized line. But how much value you're building? What are you completing? Are you able to get it done? All right, done. I mentioned this at the beginning of class. Done means done. Done means 100% done. For some reason, you get 90% done with something. The last 10% seems to take longer than the 90%. From a professionalism perspective, getting it through tests, getting it through to all the way done instead of leaving it and figuring out, oh, there's just a little bit of work left, I'll worry about it later. Not the right strategy. Okay, I think I've harped on that enough. Estimating and tracking. So I'm going to go for wrap up here. Why is it hard to do? I'd like you to pause the video for a second and consider, why do you think these things are hard to do? Okay, in software engineering, there's some well-established reasons why estimating is hard to do. One is the level of developer. Second is the speed and what I would say immaturity. A lot of organizations are not very good at tracking how they've done things in the past. They're not really interested in it. So they're really just doing estimating entirely by experience, and they're not doing it in a data-driven fashion. The most mature organizations are, and therefore they're better. Again, why you did the PSP, know yourself. Software is this infinitely malleable stuff, as Fred Brooks called it. Right? It's just constantly changing stuff, which makes it very difficult. You can't see and feel it and touch it. You can't see the bridge being built, the house being built, so it can be very difficult to estimate. No two projects are alike. Every project's unique, it seems. Rapid evolution of technology. Even while a sprint's going on, things, the technology-based changes from how they do can make you more productive, can make you less productive. And historically, we've had a high rate of turnover in our discipline. These are all kind of the minor reasons, if you will. The complexity of software, this changeability, malleability, the invisibleness, Brooks would also call it, of software makes it difficult to estimate. Tracking, why is that hard to do? Again, work does not equal value. So the problem, if you're tracking based on work, another effect of tracking based on work creates is, then people are going to respond to what you're tracking and what you're evaluating them on. So they're more apt. They'll work plenty hard, and they're focused on doing more work. They don't want to change tasks. They don't want to take things off the scrum board. They go to the project. They don't want to tell you when something comes up and change this delicate Gantt chart that the project manager has created. So a lot of times they're doing activity and there's no transparency, no visibility into it. And that's why Agile says, nope, not a Gantt chart. It's this whole area of the board in here that's all tasks we own. We can change. And I've gotten a number of emails even from the class on this. Again, user stories here, you can't change them on this column. Tasks, you change them at any point. And this literally has to be an up to the second representation of what the team is doing. All right. I go out at Tuesday at 11 o'clock at night and I look at the tag board and I email the team and say, it looks like you're doing this, this, and this. And they write back, Scrum Master writes, oh, no, that's not what we're doing. I just didn't update the Scrum board. Wrong answer. It's always instantaneously updated with whatever somebody's working on. You decide to go work on the next thing, put it in progress. At the end of the Scrum, at the end of the daily Scrum. And again, I'm not requiring. I think some teams in here are doing daily stand-ups anyway. But at a daily stand-up meeting, the daily stand-up meeting happens around the Scrum board. So it can be updated every single day. And then it's even updated throughout the day if it needs to be. Okay. So that updating the tasks that we own and what those tasks are and keeping it up to the second, that's tracking work. All right, we don't need the burn down chart for that. We are up to the second, keeping up to date in our task. Burn down charts to me are better done by tracking value. All right. It's hard to do. We're tracking things relative. When we track value, naturally you're going to get more done in the second half of a sprint. You're naturally going to have burn downs that look like this one with that one, because once to get something started and scaffolded and set up, even in the context of a 2-week sprint, means you're probably going to accomplish more in the second half of the week as you get it done. It takes a little bit of time to get the initial pulls through the board, if you will, and so forth. But it's still out there to do. All right. Okay. And so this is kind of my summary of project tracking. Why is it hard? And some of this goes for estimation as well. And this is our wrap-up slide. Again, certain things like your requirements, your resource, and your costs keep changing on a project, so it's hard to track that success. You have turnover, you have competition, you have a mismatch of things, project wasn't resourced properly and so forth. Now again, you hope to isolate that within the context of a sprint. Your sprint is supposed to be kind of your mini freeze of your scope, so you can address those things, but if you're addressing the project as a whole, it still remains a challenge. And then, you can't see it. A lot of times you can't see progress when it's being made, or perhaps you got a false positive and it's misleading. So this happens with user interface prototyping. You put up your user experience designer put up a great user interface prototype, looks great, customers excited and everybody else on the team, but then you find out, it wasn't really done. That was a prototype. And it might have been the 80-20 rule. We got 80% of the stuff done, but the last 20% is the really hard part, and it's going to take us longer. Sometimes you just can't trust what you're seeing in terms of that estimate. Okay. Understanding what you can track, and I talked last time about the iron triangle. And here I kind of made it the iron diamond. Time, cost, scope, and quality. Think about the things you can track. You can track how well you're doing from a quality perspective. Our next sprint, we're going to do continuous integration and testing, and we'll actually talk a bit about that since this is a quality class and tracking our quality, and you'll do more in 416. You can certainly track the passage of time and estimate against time. You can track your burn rate and how many dollars you're spending. All mature organizations, I don't care what methodology you're using in software development, they're doing work under contract, they're tracking their burn rate, as well as those who are paying them. And then scope. Is your scope going up and down, and so forth? And other things, you could track customer satisfaction. Are your customers still happy? These kinds of things in a mature organization are tracked over broader periods of time, is the point, than just an individual sprint. When we get to an individual sprint, we're trying to take advantage of, essentially a 2 to 4 week, however long our sprint is, assumption of a fixed boundary. We're going to have the same people, we're going to have the same scope in terms of the user story we selected. The technology changes, we shouldn't have to deal with that right away, or at least not in the context of this sprint. We may have to spike on that after a sprint or in the next sprint or something like that. But in any event, we are still, by isolating a little time box of 2 weeks, we are trying to freeze out some change. And I talked about the nature of change and embracing it. Well, some big changes we're still trying to freeze out in Agile, and we're trying to do Super Mario. I don't think I could draw a Super Mario Kart on here, so I'll just write Super Mario. We leave that to embrace the little steering changes that are made within a sprint. Okay. What does this mean for your projects? Again, on your projects, I can notice the patterns, and I'll say some things to some teams when I review. But I really don't want the team to divide and conquer estimate. It's not 4 people and you go estimate those 4 stories, you go estimate those stories, you go write the tasks and estimate them, and we'll just, we'll lump them all together so we can get that scrum board thing out that Dr. Gary wants. Then you're not really doing it right. All right. I really want it to be a team-based activity where you can work in rounds to get that convergence. All right. Formal planning, bucketized T-shirt requirements, card sorting exercises. Frankly, I don't actually care about the machinery that you use, but I would like it to be team-oriented, a in rounds, if you will, in loops and iterations itself, and by convergence. All right, get the team to say, we can agree on that. And again, record that conversation so that the assumptions about what's going on come out. And I think you'd find that very useful, particularly based on what I've asked you to do, working with new software that's unfamiliar and so forth. Working in Swing, it turns out a bunch of you haven't worked in Swing. Working with Ant, working with all new techniques I'm talking about. You could collectively all estimate poorly, but it sure feels better than one person, winging it. There's a greater chance that person will estimate poorly. The more eyeballs, the better off, and more convergence, at least to give your team confidence and a common understanding of where they're coming from. From a tracking perspective, Tega actually tracks for you. So why don't I finish with that? I'm going to discard all those. And let me go and bring up Tega real quick. Okay, so my set of projects, I'm going to go show you one over here. That's a research project I'm doing with a whole bunch of graduate students. And if you look here, so I will tell you, the product backlog has its own burn down in Tega, and that's what it's trying to show you in this root one. I'm actually more concerned about an individual Scrum board. When you go to your individual Scrum board, you can see all of the tasks on here. Let me make it a little smaller so you could see more. You could see, this is an example of a board that isn't really starting out the way I would want, in the sense that a number of things have been starting to feel like a push across the board, although a few things have been closed so far. But when you go to this view, this bar chart, and it's hard to see, but that's going to show you the burn down on here. So what this tells me, this is the idealized line where the dark green underneath it with the white dots, and this is the current line. And as these folks are moving across so far, they actually haven't burned down any points, even though they've closed some things, which means basically they close zero value stories or tasks. This is still on the task level, so they've closed some tasks, but they haven't closed any stories yet. So you can see the starting points are still all the same. There's 0 completed points. Tega gives you some idea of 40 total points a sprint, 0 completed, a task count 13 open tasks, 9 closed tasks. So I can kind of compare informally about how much work's being done versus how much value. But right now I got 0% in value. I haven't. My team hasn't actually finished anything yet. And given that their sprint's already over a week old, I'm going to have to talk to them about that tomorrow. Now let's look at the first sprint. And actually, what we have we have actually 2 concurrent sprints going. So this one's a little different, right? There were 97 total points allocated and 32 are completed. So there's a burn rate of 33% here. And we have more closed tasks and open tasks. So this one's going on concurrently. We actually have 2 different releases going on. So we did a sprint 1A and 1B. Notice how these folks are closing a lot of tasks and getting some things, some stories closed out themselves. So when we look at their burn down, well, I could tell you right now, in case you're curious, it's actually January 31st. So we're right here. The gray line kind of tells you that. And when you look at the idea, well, they're kind of right here, and they've been working underneath. They were able to close a few stories, from the 25th to the 26th. So they actually got out in front of the estimated curve. So far. So this is this concurrent sprint. This is actually an example of one that's going reasonably well, according to Tega. So you have this built in to your project. When you look at your task board, when you look at your overall release, you can also get a sense of your burn down rate for what's been estimated for the entire product backlog as well. All right. So with that, that's just a quick overview, and I'll leave it at that. Going forward, again, look at doing formal estimation this week, and at the end of the sprint, we'll be asking you about what happened on your burn down chart as part of your reflection.